So with the Far Eastern Front being announced by Enlisted, featuring Japan versus what I hope to be the Soviet Union, a lot of people are going to be asking what the heck is the situation in terms of the balancing for both factions. And in today's video, we're just going to be talking about that. Because although a lot of people seem to have been saying that it's going to be a mess up in terms of balancing, I tend to think that the balancing issue between the Soviet Union and Japan is much more balanced. So without further ado, let's just get started with the first point, and that is the weapons. Starting with the bolt actions and whatnot, all the way up to the assault rifles, both Japan and the Soviet Union are pretty dang balanced. This should come as practically no surprise because Enlisted has been trying to balance the two things out. The PPSH-41s and the Type 100 SMGs, and all the way up to the AS-44/Fedorovs against the Taipei automatic rifle. Most of the weapons are straight upright similar, and in some cases Japan has the edge, while in other cases the Soviet Union has the edge, so honestly it really depends on how many good players are on the team. The same could roughly be said for the planes, except for the fact that you can instantly argue, and rightly so, Japan has much less frontline bombers and they have more fighters, but that said, you can also argue the fact that both sides are pretty much even in the air war. In terms of just planes and fighters and whatnot, both sides are good at their own stuff. For example, the Japanese are really good at turn fighting, and especially if you're using a zero against some of the Soviet planes, you can straight upright out-turn them. As a matter of fact, it is the best turn fighter to my understanding and knowledge. On the other hand, if you look at the Soviets, their guns are pretty heavy on their planes and their bombs are pretty decent, especially for their tier, and especially if you're looking at the P-40E-1, and especially if you were talking about it, their planes are really good and can stand up a lot more hits than the Japanese planes, because last time I checked, all you have to do is hit it with machine guns and the thing goes and starts to fire. So that's great. And of course, moving down on the final gimmick, which is the tank line. A lot of people say the tank line favors the Soviet Union much more than Japan, and honestly, they do have a point. Regarding the earlier tier tanks, Japan has no ability to compete with the T-60 or the BT-7. In my personal opinion, the T-60, the BT-7, and if we're even talking about the T-70, is much better against most Japanese tanks at this tier. The only good caveat for Japan is that most of their tanks, such as the Ho-I, the Ho-I-1, and the Ho-I-3 are essentially at much lower tiers than you can find them, meaning that even though yes, they were prototypes and some of them were straight upright, not really used in combat, they do have the fortunate ability to see some of the Soviet mainline tanks, such as the T-50, the T-28, and the T-34 respectively. Tanks have a very good gun on some of them, especially if we're talking about tier 3 guns. Some of them can even crack the KV-1's frontal armor, but the issue is that they're not so good in terms of dealing against infantry. And this is pretty prevalent with the lack of a machine gun on some of the tanks via the gunner, which is not so much prevalent on the Soviet ones. And not to mention the fact that most of the Soviet tanks are much faster, which although doesn't seem like much, but with the combined armor and the combined gun, it really makes a difference. And honestly, if people just come out and spam T-34-85s or T-34s, then there's actually not a lot of things that the Soviets can do, except for pray to God that their team is competent enough to destroy said tanks. And as we move higher into the tiers, so we have the IS-2s and the IS-2 1944, and if you really played the game for a long time, the T-34-100, whereas the Japanese have tanks such as the Chi-Ri-2 and the Ho-Ri production. With the exception of the Ho-Ri production, most of the Soviet tanks all across the board have pretty light armor. Although I do have to admit now most of the Japanese tanks are essentially what you would call tanks that almost never saw the battlefield. But in terms of the balancing, is actually going to be more fair than ever, and especially if you count in the Ho-Ri. And the reason is simple. The Ho-Ri has armor that is so impressive, 120, that most Soviet guns cannot penetrate it. And as a matter of fact, it is so good that I highly doubt if you're able to penetrate it even with the IS-2. The only way to take out a Ho-Ri is the old-fashioned go around the flank, but if the said Ho-Ri is camping, then you quite literally need a plane to take it out, or unless you are really good with shooting and you hit the air vents, which is almost impossible of a shot to do. So that's something for us to note. But once again, like tanks with the Ho-Ri, the Soviets have much better rounded tanks, especially if you're talking about anti-infantry capabilities. Not that the Japanese don't have some good AP-HE or HE shells on their tanks, but across the board, I felt personally I'm much more comfortable using Soviet tanks, but that is just a personal opinion. That said, moving on in terms of the balancing, a lot of people are going to say once again that the entire situation is favoring the Soviets, but in my personal opinion, it's actually much more balanced than you think it is. And down to it, it really comes to what type of players do you have on, well, respective teams. If you have players who don't know what they're doing, well then it doesn't matter what team you're on, you're still gonna lose. If you are on players that do know what they're doing, then it doesn't matter what you do, you're still gonna win. That said, I hope this video has been helpful for you, and comment in the comment section down below of what do you guys think, and I'll see you in the next one.